Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me here for this lesson. Billy Obenauer here, and in this lesson, we're going to talk about the history of management, or what the Bateman and Konopowski management text refers to as the evolution of management. Over the course of this lesson, we're going to talk a little bit about the beginning of the practice of management and some of the factors that influenced how we look at management today. All right, we're going to summarize the five classical approaches to management. We're going to then move on to discuss the four contemporary approaches to management. And then finally, we're going to wrap it up talking about some of the modern day contributors who have influenced management today. So, why do we care about the history of management? Well, you see up here, I've got a little quote that says, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it," and that's part of it, right? There's been a lot of learning that has gone on within the discipline of management. We want to make sure that we're not repeating the same mistakes over time, but we also want to make sure that we're building upon what's been done before us. All right, so we shouldn't be starting from scratch. We should be learning from what's happened in the past and moving forward, and that's why we're going to talk a little bit about the history of management here today. Now, we often think of management as a very young discipline. I mean, the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania is one of the first management schools to be formally created, and that wasn't founded until 1881. But if we think about management through the perspective of coordinating resources and how we organize people to help achieve goals, management has actually been around in some way, shape, or form for at least 7,000 years. So, what do we mean when we say management's been around for about 7,000 years? Let's take a look at a few examples from our history here. Okay. And we'll start with the Great Pyramids in approximately 4000 BC. The Egyptians used planning, organizing, leading, and controlling to build the pyramids. This was followed up by the Chinese applying concepts of delegation, cooperation, efficiency, organization, and control in around 1100 BC. And then in 500 BC, Sun Tzu discussed the importance of planning and leading his book, The Art of War, a book that is still read by managers today. All right, this was followed up by the Greeks recognizing management as a separate art, and they actually advocated that there should be a scientific approach to work in management. Then we saw in the 1400s AD, the Venetians standardized production with an assembly and inventory system. And then we had Adam Smith discussing control and specialization for manufacturing workers in 1776. So what we see is throughout our history over the course of this 7,000 years, there are many great examples of where even though we may not have looked at management as a formal discipline, it was being applied in what people were doing. Now, the Industrial Revolution really served as a catalyst for the field of management. And part of the reason for that is that there was a much more structured approach to work during the Industrial Revolution. And when we combine that with some of the technological advancements at this time, we really started to see the emergence of economies of scale. And what we mean by economies of scale are that the more that an organization produced, the more that their cost of production actually decreased. So, economies of scale led to increased production, not only driving up revenues, but also driving down costs and making management even more important. How increased production resulting from the Industrial Revolution impacts our need for management can be very well illustrated by discussion of Eli Whitney's cotton gin. Okay, now for those of you who may not be familiar with what a cotton gin is, basically cotton has to go through a process where we get the seeds out of it so we can move into the next stage of processing. And that traditionally had been done manually. Okay, but in 1794, Eli Whitney introduced a machine called the cotton gin that allowed that to be done through a more automatic fashion. Okay, and according to Whitney, he had never seen a person clean more than a pound of cotton per day manually. But with the use of his gin, one person could process 50 pounds of cotton per day. So you might be wondering, why would management skills be more important after the introduction of the cotton gin? Well, for one thing, there's going to be a lot more coordination that needs to go on from there. Okay, because each person is going to be responsible for a lot more production. We have the ability to process more product. That means we're going to have more shipping, more processing. We have potentially more sales markets and so on. There's a lot of coordination that's going to go on with this increased production. Additionally, our efficiencies become more important. All right, if one person who's capable of processing a pound of cotton per day is working at 50% efficiency, we're only going to lose a half a pound per day of production. Okay, it's not great to lose that half a pound per day, but it may not seem like the end of the world. Okay, if one person who could process 50 pounds of cotton per day is working at 50% efficiency, we're going to lose 25 pounds per day in terms of production. And that's a much greater loss than we had previously. As we talk about the evolution of management, we really break the different approaches into two groups. Okay, so for those approaches that were developed prior to the mid 1930s, we refer to those as the classical approaches. Those that were developed after about 1935 are typically referred to as the contemporary approaches. Now we're going to go in a somewhat chronological order here. So we're going to start with the classical approaches, and they include systematic management, scientific management, bureaucracy, administrative management, and human relations. So, the first approach that we're going to talk about here is systematic management. And as we've already hinted at here, the need for this was really brought upon us by the Industrial Revolution. And systematic management focused on processes and procedures, and it kind of emphasized internal operations and really the need for efficiency in our production. All right, but as we've also mentioned, management was a fairly young discipline early on in the Industrial Revolution. So, at the time, there was not a lot of consensus in terms of what the ideal processes and procedures were. And that was one of the limitations of systematic management. Another potential limitation of systematic management is that it could have a negative impact on employees. And this is because systematic management placed a lot of emphasis on how do we improve efficiencies through processes and procedures, but it placed very little emphasis on the employee outcomes. All right. Now, employees were not a strong focus, and part of the reason for this is that we had limited government regulation at the time. Okay, so it may be hard to think about this within the context of today. Today, we have OSHA who protects worker safety. We have regulations that deal with overtime pay and minimum wage, but we didn't have all these things back in the time of the Industrial Revolution. There was also a very poorly organized labor force back during the Industrial Revolution, particularly in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. And what that means is that workers had very limited recourse in terms of how they could push back against changes that were implemented by managers. And then finally, from a cultural standpoint, managers cared a lot more about profits than they cared about people at that time. So now along comes Frederick Taylor. And Taylor recognizes that there are inefficiencies in systematic management. And he says, what we really need to be doing is we really need to be applying scientific methods to the field of management. Okay. And then if we apply scientific methods and we study these things, we should be able to identify the one best way that we can complete our production tasks. And Taylor used something called a time and motion study. And with a time and motion study, what he did was he observed how work was performed and looked to break it down from a scientific perspective and find the most efficient ways to do things. All right, and this is really kind of like a precursor for ergonomics. If you're familiar with ergonomics, which is the study of how people interact with technology in the workforce to do things more effectively and efficiently, that's kind of what Taylor was getting at with his time and motion studies, because he was essentially looking at how are people using their tools. How can we break down the way they're using these tools and remove inefficiencies from the process? And Taylor identified four basic principles for scientific management. The first of them is that management should develop a precise scientific approach for each element of one's work. In other words, we need to know how the work needs to be done, and that should be identified scientifically. All right, management should also select and place each worker so the right person has the right job. Okay, and this seems so very basic. Just like you wouldn't want me teaching your biology class because I am not the right person to teach a biology class, we need to make sure that in our factories we have the right people doing the right work. Okay. The third principle is that management should cooperate with workers to ensure that their job matches the plans and principles. All right, so workers often have a lot more information about the actual work that they're doing, and managers should be interacting with them to make sure that the work that they're doing is aligned with what the company or the organization's goals are. And then finally, management should ensure an appropriate division of work and responsibility between managers and employees. All right. Now, Taylor also had five best practices that he referred to. And the first one was to hire and train the proper workers. And this is very much closely aligned with his principle that you should select and place the right worker in the right job. If you don't hire and train the right people, it's going to be very hard to put the right people in the right job. Okay. He also called for standardization of tools. And I'll give you an example of what we mean by standardizing. If we think about our keyboards today, we typically have our letters in the same place. So I'm here teaching in the US and we have what you call a QWERTY keyboard where the letters right across the top are QWERTY. And that's pretty much standardized over here. So if I work on my computer or I work on somebody else's computer or I go to the library, my keyboard's always going to look the same and I don't have to adjust to that. That's the idea of standardization. All right, Taylor also said we should document instructions, and he advocated for instruction cards that could go to employees. And this makes me think of when we first started teaching in the classroom after the COVID-19 pandemic hit. Okay, we went back to the classrooms. There was new technology in the classroom so that we could be social distanced and do remote learning and all these things. But there were no instructions anywhere on how to use the technology. So all the faculty were trying to learn this on their own and figure it out. And if we had just had an instruction card like Taylor advocated for, that process could have maybe been a lot simpler. All right, Taylor also said that we should incorporate breaks for our employees. And the reason for that is that a more well rested employee is going to be a more effective employee. And then finally, he introduced the idea of a differential piece rate system. Okay, and what this builds on is a traditional piece rate system pays you a certain amount of money per product produced. So maybe if you're in a widget factory and you get $1 per widget produced, they want you to produce you produce 15 widgets in an hour. Each hour you make $15, but maybe they want you to produce 20 widgets in an hour. Okay, so if you reach that goal of 20 widgets in an hour, maybe instead of paying you $1 per widget, they pay you $1.25 per widget. And that's a differential piece rate system. So you essentially have a rate that you're paid per piece produced unless you hit a certain goal, in which case your rate increases. Taylor's protege was Henry Gantt, and Gantt built upon this idea of the piece rate system, but he said, hey, we should expand this to our frontline supervisors. And our frontline supervisors should receive bonuses based upon their workers completing their assigned daily tasks. And the purpose of this was to give a little motivation for the frontline supervisors to manage their employees a little more effectively, work to motivate them and train them as necessary. Gantt was also known for creating the Gantt chart, which I'm going to show you here on this next slide. So the Gantt chart's essentially a little bit of a matrix. And over here on the left, what you see is that we have our tasks listed in this column. All right. And then what you'll see over here on top is that we have our timeline, okay, in terms of when do we have to accomplish our tasks by. We're able to build out a little bit of a matrix here that shows us what we have to do and when we have to do it. So for example, if we were looking at meeting as a group to discuss and identify areas for clarification, we see we've got that scheduled here for September 5th. All right, and that's in our September column. All right, if we were to go over to write sections 1 to 3, we see that's in our October column and scheduled for October 31st. So the Gantt chart really lets you put a visual to what your timeline is in terms of completing your tasks. Frank and Lillian Gilbreth were also very important contributors to scientific management. Now, Frank Gilbreth used motion studies to identify and remove wasteful movements, similar to what we talked about with Taylor earlier. And what one of the great examples that Gilbreth used dealt with bricklayers. And he looked at bricklayers were using over 20 different motions in the laying of one brick. And he was able to reduce that through his analysis down to about 8 motions. And this increased the bricklayer's productivity so that somebody could go from laying about 1,000 bricks a day to 2,700. Now, Lillian Gilbreth was like a superhero in her own right. In addition to taking sole responsibility for raising their 12 children, she was also a very accomplished scholar and professor. All right, and her research was very focused on the human side of management. Okay, so she cared a lot about people's mental well being, looked at things such as the advantages of breaks for employees, the impacts of having suggestion boxes and books available to employees, and how these things could help to improve productivity in the workplace. Henry Ford successfully applied the principles of scientific management to his manufacturing of automobiles. Now, Ford didn't invent the automobile, but he is the person who is most well known for it. And that's because prior to Henry Ford, automobiles had to be produced in something that we called an automobile boutique. Okay, and in these boutiques, you basically had one or two people who were specialists in building cars, and they did everything from the ground up. Now, Ford, building on this idea of scientific management, said, hey, you know what? I don't need a person who can build a whole car. I need a person who can build a wheel. I need a person who can put a tire on a wheel. I need a person who can mount a wheel onto an automobile, and so on and so forth, and applied these principles of scientific management as he began building assembly lines and changing the way we produce the automobile. Next, we're going to talk about the bureaucracy. Okay, and Max Weber, a sociologist from Germany, was very troubled by inconsistencies that he saw between managers. Okay, so those of us who have been in the workplace have probably worked in areas where we have multiple managers in the same organization, and these managers treat their employees very differently. Okay, so one manager may be someone who disciplines employees in such a way that they have kind of a three strike process. All right, another manager may be somebody who disciplines employees in such a way that it's very informal, and somebody could have 12 strikes before they're ever written up. Okay, and in this type of situation, your personnel record could be much more impacted by who the manager is who's managing the personnel than what the personnel are doing and how they're performing. All right, so Weber essentially proposed that we have a formal structural network of relationships within our organizations so that we can reduce these inconsistencies between managers. And that structure is what we call a bureaucracy. Now, Weber said that for bureaucracy to be effective, we had to have a division of labor such that tasks, assignments, and authority were clearly specified. In other words, we know whose job it is to do what job. Okay. We also have to have authority established such that the chain of command of hierarchy is clearly defined. All right. I know who my boss is. My boss knows who their boss is, and I don't go around my boss. I go to my boss if I have an issue. Okay. We need to focus on qualifications such that employees are selected and promoted based upon merit, not based upon their relationships. So friendship should be irrelevant when it comes to selecting and hiring employees and promoting employees. All right. We need to focus on ownership such that managers, not owners, should run the organization. And we also need to have impersonal rules that are applied consistently and fairly. And for examples on this, I'd encourage you to take a look at my video on the hot stove rule of discipline. Now, we've all probably heard bureaucracy used as a bad word at one time. Okay, now a bureaucracy in and of itself is not a bad thing, but very often it's applied poorly or it's abused. Okay, and some of the things that can happen when it's applied poorly or abused is we'll see organizations be very inflexible, or we'll see people abuse their power that results from the bureaucracy. All right, so I'll give you an example from my career here. Is I worked for at one point in time a smaller company, had about 200 employees, and that company had a customer service department. And customer service reps in this department would take quote requests from customers. Okay, so a customer might call, somebody would answer the phone, and the person who answered the phone would write down what the customer wanted an estimate on. They'd fill out a form. All right, these quote requests were then given to a pricing department for entry into the system. All right, once the pricing department got them entered, the pricing manager would review the pricing, and then ultimately the pricing department would send out the quote. Now, a lot of times what would happen is the pricing department was smaller than the customer service department. So the customer service department would be taking a lot of quote requests from customers and taking them faster than the pricing department could get them entered. Okay. But in this bureaucratic structure, it was the responsibility of the pricing department to enter those quotes. All right. And it was the responsibility of the pricing manager to review all of those quotes. All right, this was a little bit problematic because it resulted in poor service for our customers. But the pricing department really held on to this power because holding on to this power kind of made them a little bit indispensable. All right, so it was actually a situation where customer service reps knew how to enter the quotes, but they would get reprimanded if they did so. All right, I eventually became the pricing manager in this department. And when I did this, we kind of opened up things a little bit in the bureaucracy. We allowed customer service reps to enter their quotes, and we allowed them to give out the quotes without being reviewed by a manager. We allowed them to just ask if they wanted a manager to review it. And the reason we did this was because our bureaucracy was actually creating problems for our business and making it very difficult for people to do their jobs. The next approach we're going to talk about is administrative management. Okay, and the key principle behind administrative management is that management is a profession like law or medicine, and because it's a profession, it can be taught through the use of major principles. All right, but critics of administrative management argue that management is too contextual for broad principles to apply. All right, I'd kind of push back on that a little bit, and I would say I think law and medicine are a little bit contextual as well. All right, if you have a heart attack, you don't go see your podiatrist, do you? No, you are going to go talk to a cardiologist because medicine is contextual. All right, so I think the fact that management is contextual doesn't necessarily invalidate the approach to administrative management. Again, key principle here is that management is a profession, and because it's a profession, it can be taught through the use of major principles. Now, Henry Fayol was one of the key contributors to the administrative management approach, and he identified 5 functions that managers can use to achieve superior organizational performance. Now, if you take a look at these functions, you're going to see they're very similar to the 4 functions that we talked about during chapter 1. Okay, so you had planning, organizing, and controlling were identical. And then he also had commanding and coordinating. And these two, if you look at them, they really fall under the heading of leading. So very similar to what we talked about in chapter 1. Fayol also articulated 14 principles of management. Fayol's principles included dividing work into specialized tasks and assigning responsibility to specific individuals, delegating authority along with responsibility. Okay, disciplining, making sure expectations are clear, and punishing violations so that people strive to meet expectations. Having a unity of command where people are assigned to only one supervisor. All right, those of us who have worked in retail or maybe in hospitality may have been in situations where there are multiple frontline managers giving directions to our line level employees. And the line level employees sometimes aren't sure about who it is that they need to listen to. FAL said, no, we need to have a unity of command so that doesn't happen. He also said we need to have a unity of direction so employees' efforts are focused on achieving the organizational objectives. We need to subordinate our individual interests to the general interests of the organization. Okay, what does that mean? Is that we need to put the organization's goals ahead of our own sometimes. So I think of an example like this. Well, when I was in retail, Black Friday was a very important day to us. Okay, Black Friday is the day after Thanksgiving, a holiday in the United States, right? So people would be off the day before. We would have to set for Black Friday, prepare for Black Friday on Wednesday night before the holiday. Well, nobody wanted to stay late that Wednesday night, but we had to stay late or Friday was not going to be very successful. So that's an example of subordinating our individual interests. All right, he also said that we need to systematically reward efforts that support the organization's direction. And this is going to help motivate employees to support the organization's direction and help us achieve our goals. He also spoke to centralization or determining the relative importance of superior and subordinate roles. All right, keeping our communications within the chain of command. In other words, not trying to go around your boss, so to speak. All right, ordering jobs and materials so that they support the organization's direction. Equity, having fair discipline in order to enhance employee commitment. He spoke about this a little bit in a few of his principles, right? All right. Then we had stability and tenure of personnel. So we promote employee loyalty and longevity by letting them know that they're secure within our organization. All right. And encouraging our employees to act on their own in support of our direction. All right. And then finally, promoting a unity of interest between employees and management. Now, one of the criticisms of Fayol is that people say his principles can be a little bit rigid and tough to achieve, but he really meant for these principles to be applied flexibly. Another important contributor to administrative management was Chester Barnard, who's most well known for his book, The Functions of the Executive. In this book, he kind of outlined the roles of the senior executive as formulating the purpose of the organization, hiring key individuals, and maintaining organizational communications. Mary Parker Follett built upon the work of Barnard and really emphasized that managers are consistently dealing with changing situations. And her primary contributions focused on this idea that managers need to and desire to remain flexible, and that there are strong differences between motivating groups and motivating individuals. The final classical approach that we're going to talk about today is human relations, which can really be summarized as our attempt to understand and explain how human psychological and social processes interact with the formal aspects of our work, the things we've been talking about throughout this entire lesson, and how that interaction influences our performance. And what's really cool about human relations is that it was really inspired by and built upon scientific management. The next study that we're going to talk about was actually initially a scientific management study. Okay. And one of the things that we'll find that we emphasize here in human relations is that informal work relationships and worker satisfaction play a very important role in workplace outcomes and productivity. Now, that scientific management study that I mentioned on the previous slide, that's what we refer to as the Hawthorne studies, which were a series of experiments conducted in the Western Electric Company in Chicago from 1924 to 1932. And what the researchers were initially trying to find out in these studies was how different levels of lighting impacted people's performance. So they would go into the factory and they would increase the lighting, they would decrease the lighting, sometimes decreasing it all the way down to like moonlight levels. And they were trying to find a relationship between lighting levels and productivity. Okay. But the workers knew what was being studied. They knew that lighting was being studied here in the organization. And what happened was every time the lighting changed, people's productivity changed, typically increasing when the lighting went up, increasing when the lighting went down. Okay. And what researchers concluded from this is that people were reacting to being reminded that they were being observed. Okay. So once it became a little more salient that people were being observed, their performance would increase, their productivity would increase. And that's what we call the Hawthorne effect. Okay. Now, the researchers then went on to do interviews and a whole bunch of other things within the organizations. And overall, they concluded that the informal work group played a very important role in productivity and employee behavior. Another important contributor to this area of human relations is Abraham Maslow. Okay, Maslow is best known for his hierarchy of needs, which basically says we have people have five different levels of needs. Okay, we got physiological needs, we have safety needs, love and belonging, esteem, and self-actualization. Maslow basically said these needs are prioritized. Okay, so we have to meet the needs at the bottom, the physiological needs, before we care about the next level of needs, and so on and so forth. All right. So if you think about this from an intuitive standpoint, basically what Maslow is saying is if you were starving, you have not met your physiological needs, and you're not really going to worry all that much about making friends. You're going to be a lot more focused on finding food. Okay. And this is very intuitive, makes a lot of sense to people. So people still talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs quite a bit. So it's pretty important that you at least have a basic understanding of what this hierarchy means. But the fun fact here is that Maslow's hierarchy of needs lacks scientific evidence. While we do have some evidence that needs are important to people and needs can impact workplace outcomes, we don't really have much evidence that Maslow's hierarchy, that the order of the needs, the way he presented them, is actually the way that people behave. So what I want you to remember as you look at this is I want you to understand Maslow's hierarchy of needs so that you have the ability to talk to people about it intelligently. But I also want you to recognize that we need to be careful when using Maslow's hierarchy of needs in terms of making decisions because there's not really scientific evidence that would support that. All right, so we're going to move forward into contemporary approaches of management here. And the first one that we're going to talk about is socio-technical systems theory. And basically, what socio-technical systems theory is telling us is that things need to fit together. So we need to have employees, tools, knowledge, and training that all fit together, that all complement each other if we want to be able to produce products and services that are valued by our customer. All right, and research in this area was really the precursor to the total quality management movement that many of us are familiar with today. Sociotechnical systems theory also promotes the use of teamwork and semi autonomous work groups. All right, a key principle here is that workers need the autonomy to fix problems before they escalate. All right, so for example, if we're producing automobiles on an assembly line and we notice that there's some sort of issue, maybe a part's getting set incorrectly, maybe a bolt's not going into the car. I don't know that much about producing automobiles on an assembly line to give you a perfect example here, but if I'm an employee on that line and I notice a problem, I need to be able to stop that line, to shut down that line, and keep us from producing these automobiles incorrectly. All right. We don't want to wait until all the cars are produced wrong and have to be taken apart or disposed of to address the issue. All right. According to socio-technical systems theory, if an employee notices that there is a problem in the assembly line, they need the autonomy to stop that line and fix the problems before they get any worse. Now, the next approach that we're going to talk about here is quantitative management. And as its name would indicate, this emphasizes the application of quantitative analysis to informing and helping to guide our managerial decisions. All right. And as we do this, we start to develop formal mathematical models of a problem. And these can include tools such as linear programming, forecasting, and big data. Now, managers are not always receptive to quantitative management. So I want you to think about why might managers resist quantitative management? Well, I'm going to go through a few potential reasons with you. The first is that managers aren't always trained in quantitative analysis. All right, quantitative analysis is not always a focal point of business or management education. So because our managers aren't trained in this area, they may not be very knowledgeable in it. And when the results of a quantitative analysis differ from someone's intuition, they may not fully trust the quantitative analysis and may not want to allow it to inform their decision making process. All right. Additionally, not all models are perfect or effective. Remember, our models are programmed by people. Okay. And sometimes when these models aren't perfect or effective, people remember this and it results in the degrading of their trust in quantitative analysis. And I'll give you an example here. On the screen you see a roll of foam here in the background, and that's what we call silcial. All right. And again, I was in the construction industry. I sold building materials, and at the beginning of every house sale, at the beginning of building every house, you need silcial. You need rolls of it. Okay. It's basically a product that helps keep bugs and mice out of a house after it's constructed. It goes on concrete. I'm not going to break down exactly how we build a house, but it's the first thing you need when building a house. Okay, so if I'm selling a job lot of building materials to a customer and I'm at a sill seal, that's a big deal because they get a $50,000 lumber delivery and they can't touch it because they don't have this one product. Okay, now sill seal, when I was in the industry, we sold it for like $3 or $4. I think it cost us like $1. All right. So it seemed like something that we really didn't need to manage our inventory on too tightly. But the quantitative management side of our inventory management was recommending what we needed to keep in our inventory. And at one point in time in a company that I was at, every single store was running out of sill seal all the time because the way our models were set up, they were not giving us the right amount of product for when we had major job lots. All right. As a result, we all lost confidence in these models, and we actually stopped using them. We actually started doing things to kind of fake the model so that we could get the inventory that we wanted. We were kind of trying to trick the model by faking certain things so we made sure we didn't run out of product and disappoint our customers. All right. Managers are also just very resistant to change. Okay. Sometimes we have a way that we like to do something, we think it's the right way, and we don't want to learn a new way. So if we were not raised on quantitative management, we may be resistant to transition to it. So, what are the impacts when managers are resistant to quantitative management? For starters, they may cherry pick the data that they incorporate into their decision making process, or they may cherry pick the results that they share with people when explaining their decisions. So, for example, at one point in time, I was at an organization that was struggling, and a member of our senior leadership team was delivering a presentation, and they were very selective in the results that they shared with us. They only shared data analysis results that supported their decision. Anything that didn't support their decision was not incorporated in the presentation. All right, and that's an example of cherry picking. All right, managers may also use data management techniques only as a supplement or maybe as a tool in the final decision making process, but they may not be the thing that drives the decision making process. So, for example, managers may make decisions without really incorporating data management, but then as they're explaining their decisions, utilize the data that help to support their plan. Another contemporary approach that we're going to discuss here is organizational behavior. And this is an area that I'm really passionate about. And organizational behavior basically looks at the complex relationships between the individual, the group, and the organization, right? And how do these relationships influence our success? Organizational behavior is really derived from a variety of different disciplines. Okay, so anthropology, psychology, sociology, they have all contributed to organizational behavior. And when we conduct research in this area, we often will pull a theory from one of these other disciplines and then apply it to the context of organizations and to the context of management. So, for example, I often see psychological theories incorporated into organizational behavior research because essentially what we're doing is we're taking these psychological theories and we're just applying them within the structure of an organization. One organizational behavior theory that you may be familiar with is McGregor's principle of theory X, theory Y. Okay. And what this basically says is that managers subscribe to one of these two theories. All right. And if they subscribe to theory X, they believe that workers are lazy and workers require supervision. And then there are other managers who subscribe to theory Y, where they believe that workers want to work and they're capable of self management. All right. And people have argued that if they're proponents of theory Y, that theory X can be dangerous because we can have a self-fulfilling prophecy or a Pygmalion effect, right? Where if we treat people like they're lazy and we treat them like they require supervision, eventually they're going to become lazy and they're going to require supervision. So we're better off to treat them from a theory Y perspective like they want to work and they're capable of self-management, because if we do treat them that way, that is how they'll respond. The final contemporary theory that we'll talk about is systems theory. And systems theory basically says that we take inputs and we convert them to outputs. Okay, so we take a tree in input and we convert it into lumber in output. We take lumber in input and we convert it into a house in output, right? And the theory also states that the organization is part of a managed system. So each organization is part of something else, right? So the example that we have here is Southwest Airlines is a subsystem of the airline industry, and the flight crews are a subsystem of Southwest. And all these things kind of work together. And each of these subsystems is dependent upon the next system that it is a part of. All right. So, for example, what the flight crews do is going to be dependent upon what Southwest as an organization does. And what Southwest as an organization does is going to be dependent upon what the airline industry on the whole does. And what the airline industry on the whole does is going to be dependent upon what the economy does, and so on and so forth. Related to that, within systems theory, there's this idea of a contingency perspective. And this basically says that our strategies and our processes are going to depend on the situation. Okay. So there's not really one best way to manage. We have to think about what the situation looks like, and that should impact how we're going to manage. Okay. So the relationship between our input and our outcome is going to be dependent on contingency variables. Okay. So, for example, you might think as a manager, that it is a very nice thing to do and it's going to make your employees feel very good if you buy them lunch. Okay. That might seem to make a lot of sense. Well, what if it's the night crew? Okay. Do you think the night crew really wants to get up while they're sleeping to come in and eat the lunch that you bought them? No. For the night crew, you might be better off buying them dinner or buying them breakfast on either end of their shift, right? That would be a contingency variable. What crew, what shift we're talking about is the contingency variable in that situation. So now let's take a look at some of our modern contributors to our understanding of management. First, we have Peter Drucker, who emphasized the need for organizations to set clear objectives. All right, in particular, he brought about the idea of management by objective, which basically says we're going to look at outcomes as opposed to processes in a lot of situations. All right, he looked at decentralization or situations where we take the power away from the centrality of the organization and we empower our employees. Okay, we give our employees a little more autonomy, and that kind of is very consistent with Drucker's idea that people are assets and there are knowledge workers who provide much more than their labor to our organization, but they provide their ideas. All right, then we have Jack Welch, who's the former CEO of General Electric. All right, and many say that Jack mastered all the critical aspects of leadership, like people, process, strategy, and structure. All right, Welch is also very well known for his use of forced choice rankings. And with forced choice rankings, what we do is we basically look at our people and we say, most of our people are going to have acceptable performance. All right, there's going to be a very small percentage of them, maybe about 15%, that are top performers. And we have to identify those top performers. We have to recognize those top performers. And we have to prepare for our in our pipeline to promote those top performers. All right. And there's also a small percentage of our employees who are bottom performers. Okay. And Welch said maybe about 10% of our employees are bottom level performers and they need to be removed from the organization. All right. And Welch's use of forced choice rankings is actually very controversial. So I'm not saying that that is necessarily what you should do, but it is something that he's very well known for. We'll also take a look at Michael Porter, who is a competitive strategy expert and has published over 125 articles and 18 books on this subject. Okay, Porter is most well known for his five forces, all right, which you see in the upper right hand corner of the slide, and we're going to talk about them a little more in the chapter 3 lesson. Okay, Sheryl Sandberg, the chief operating officer of Facebook, she wrote a very important, impactful book called Lean In: Women, Work, and the Will to Lead. And while she encourages women to be more proactive in seeking challenges at work, she also sheds a lot of light on the discrimination that females can face in the workplace. Some other modern day contributors include strategy professors at Instead who wrote a book called Blue Ocean Strategy. And what Blue Ocean Strategy says basically is that there are red oceans and there are blue oceans. And the red oceans are the oceans that are red from the blood of competition. And that if we want to be successful in today's markets, what we need to do is we need to find the blue oceans where there is no competition. And we need to tap into these entirely new markets to grow our businesses. Then we have Martin Davidson over at the University of Virginia's Darden School of Business. And what Davidson does is he researches issues related to diversity and actually teaches and consults with global leaders as to how they can use diversity to strategically drive performance within their companies. Now, these are only a few of the modern day contributors that we have there in the field of management, but they help to give you some idea about what people are working on today. Now, as we think about management moving forward, the key here is going to be think flexibility. Okay. There's going to be new technologies. We're going to see flexible work arrangements arise. All right. There's going to be new opportunities and new demands, and people are going to be changing. Right. So we need to be open to being flexible. If we go back to our chapter one lesson, you remember we talked about Kodak and Kodak not adapting to new technology. Well, we don't want to be Kodak, right? We want to be flexible. We want to be prepared to succeed. So maintaining that flexibility is going to be a key factor there. All right. I want to thank you so much for joining me here for this lesson. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something, and we'll talk to you soon.